This is the story of a young, newly qualified Scottish doctor who served as a surgeon's mate at the bloody Battle of Culloden in 1746, managed to evade capture by the Redcoats, and fled across the Atlantic, where he was destined to become an American hero. I stumbled across his story on a visit to Savannah, Georgia, in the United States. Among the many attractions of this historic and stylish city are its elegant 19th century mansions. The Mercer Williams House is one of them. That Mercer name immediately rang a bell with me, and I knew it was a Jacobite bell. In more recent times, 40 years ago, the house became notorious when its owner, Jim Williams, shot and killed his young lover, Danny Hansford. Williams said he had fired in self-defense. Others accused him of murder. The story is told in the best-selling book and movie with the same wonderfully evocative title of Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. Online research took me whizzing back through the centuries, first to the man called Hugh Mercer, who commissioned the building of the house in Savannah, and then to his great-grandfather. He too was called Hugh Mercer, and he was born in Scotland in 1726. From that date and other information online, I immediately realised why his name had rung that bell with me. When I came home from the US, I went to my bookshelves and took up my copy of No Quarter Given, the muster roll of Prince Charles Edward Stuart's army, 1745 to 46. This lists the regiments and many of the men who served during the Rising of 1745. Under the leadership of Prince Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie, the aim of the 45 was to oust the House of Hanover and put the House of Stuart back on the British throne. Hugh Mercer is listed in the muster roll as a surgeon in Pitsligo's Horse, the cavalry regiment led by Lord Pitsligo. I've consulted this book many times, but somehow my eye had slid over Hugh and the brief description of his subsequent fate: escaped America. He was born in the fisher town of Rosehearty near Fraserburgh, on the often blustery northeast coast of Scotland. His father was the local minister. The Peathill Kirk sits on the hill above Rosehearty. The Mercer's close neighbour was Alexander Forbes, or Forbes, in the local pronunciation, 4th Lord Pitsligo. His home was Pitsligo Castle. A scholar and a gentleman, he was a convivial man who enjoyed good company and good conversation. He and young Hugh would have known each other well. The records of Marischal College at Aberdeen University show that Hugh graduated in medicine in 1744 at the age of 18. He started his studies when he was just 15. Going to university at a young age was not unusual back in the 18th century. Other contemporary records describe Hugh as a surgeon's mate. He wasn't quite 20 years old when he stood on the field at Culloden, a bit young to be practising as a doctor on his own account. He was probably the apprentice of Dr. Cruikshank, Lord Pitsligo's personal physician. Alexander Forbes was in his late 60s at the time of the 45 and a lifelong sufferer from asthma. Pitsligo's Horse was described as consisting of around 200 gentlemen and their servants. They joined Prince Charles at Duddingston in Edinburgh and went with the Jacobite army on the march into England, to Manchester and then Derby, before retreating back to Scotland. They were at the battles of Falkirk and Culloden. Escaping from the field after the Jacobite defeat, young Hugh Mercer became a fugitive in his own country. Eventually he managed to sail from Leith to Philadelphia. Many Scots first stepped ashore here when they arrived in the New World. He began working as an apothecary in a town now known as Mercersburg. 10 years after Culloden, he served in the American forces of the king he had fought against there, both as a surgeon and a soldier. In the course of what became known as the French and Indian War, part of the wider global 7 Years' War, he met George Washington, and the two became lifelong friends. They served together at Fort Duquesne, modern-day Pittsburgh. In this war, different Native American tribes allied themselves to either the French or the British side. At one stage, after a raid on an Indian village, Hugh Mercer was wounded, a musket ball breaking a bone in his arm. He was separated from his unit and alone in hostile territory. He walked 100 miles back to safety, and it took him 2 weeks. The story of his trek was written up in a newspaper printed and owned by Benjamin Franklin, and Mercer became a bit of a celebrity. The Pennsylvania Gazette told the story like this. We hear that Captain Mercer was 14 days in getting to Fort Littleton. He had a miraculous escape, living 10 days on 2 dried clams and a rattlesnake, with the assistance of a few berries. The snake kept sweet for several days, and, coming near Fort Shirley, he found a piece of dry beef, which our people had lost, and on trial rejected it because the snake was better. His wounded arm is in a good way, though it could be but badly dressed, and a bone broken. George Washington encouraged his friend to settle in Fredericksburg, Virginia. Hugh married a woman called Isabella Gordon, had 5 children with her, and became a well-respected and well-loved family doctor and apothecary. You can visit a recreation of his apothecary's shop in Fredericksburg today. Like many in Virginia, he owned a plantation, some of whose workers were enslaved. He and Washington were members of the local Masonic Lodge, and also part of a group which met at the Rising Sun Tavern, where the talk was of revolution and what was initially referred to as the dispute with the mother country. Feelings were running high, especially about taxes levied on the 13 British colonies in America by the British government in London. No taxation without representation became the rallying call. Rising anger led to the Boston Tea Party, where an entire shipment of tea from the East India Company was thrown into Boston Harbour. One of those who gathered round the fire at the Rising Sun in Fredericksburg was John Paul Jones, father of the American Navy, and also a Scotsman, originally from Kirkbean in Galloway. He later also became a Rear Admiral in the Russian Navy, which was a neat trick. When war broke out in April 1775, Mercer said he would rather go beyond the mountains and live with the Indians than submit to the tyranny of Great Britain. He also said, Hugh Mercer will serve his adopted country and the cause of liberty in any rank or station to which he may be assigned. He was made a general and considered to have great talent when it came to military strategy. Even though the Declaration of Independence was signed in July 1776, by the end of that year the British seemed to be winning the fight. They held New York and Rhode Island, and morale in the Continental Army was at rock bottom. Then came the bold move. On Christmas night 1776, George Washington led the crossing of the Delaware River to take the soldiers on the other side by surprise. They were the much-feared Hessians, who were fighting as mercenaries for the British Army at their post in Trenton, New Jersey. Some historians say Hugh Mercer, as much as Washington, was behind this daring action. The Hessians were crack troops. The farmers, farm boys and other men who made up the Continental Army were exhausted, cold, ill-clad and demoralised. They were badly shod too. One man noted that the snow on the ground was sprinkled with spots of red, blood seeping through their worn-out shoes from cuts on their feet. Washington made an inspirational speech, as Mercer too urged them to keep going. Each man was given a bonus of $10. It was freezing cold, with ice floes in the river as they rowed across late in the evening of Christmas Day. The flat-bottomed boats carrying 2,400 men arrived on the morning of December the 26th. This was the start of what became known as the 10 Crucial Days. Although the Revolutionary War raged for another 7 years, this was the turning point for morale, confidence, and the belief that the Americans could win the fight. The Continental Army defeated the Hessians at the Battle of Trenton. On January the 3rd, 1777, they took British troops by surprise at the Battle of Princeton. Mercer's horse was shot out from under him, and the troops he led had their line broken by a British advance. He walked forward to try to rally them, only to be struck on the head by the butt of a musket. The blow felled him, and he found himself surrounded by redcoats. Some accounts say they told him to "Surrender, you damn rebel," to which Mercer gave the defiant reply, "I am no rebel." In his own account, Mercer said they had indeed called him a rebel and demanded his surrender, but he said nothing in response. Determined to die, as I had lived, an honoured soldier in a just and righteous cause, and without begging for my life or making reply, I lunged with my sword at the nearest man. They then bayoneted and left me. The heroic moment when the wounded Mercer tried to fight on is captured in a famous painting which now hangs in the art gallery of Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut. The soldiers bayoneted Hugh Mercer 7 times and left him for dead, but he was still alive. His men later carried him to a nearby farmhouse. He was cared for there by the two Quaker sisters in whose home he was, Sarah and Hannah Clark, and a black servant called Susanna, who had recently been freed from slavery. The house still stands, with a memorial to Mercer close by. Dr. Benjamin Rush helped tend to Mercer and had high hopes he would recover, as did George Washington. Cornwallis, commander of the British troops whom the Americans had been fighting, sent his regimental surgeon to see if he could help. He too thought Mercer might recover. Washington's young nephew, Captain George Lewis, was there when he examined him. Another famous painting by George Wilson Peale, a treasure of Princeton University Art Museum, shows George Washington as the victor of the Battle of Princeton, with the mortally wounded Mercer lying behind him, being cared for by Benjamin Rush and George Lewis, who is holding the American flag. As a doctor himself, Mercer was well able to judge the severity of his wounds. He asked George Lewis to raise his right arm and showed the British surgeon, "The smallest of my wounds, but which will prove the most fatal. Yes, sir, that is the fellow that will do my business." He died 9 days later in George Lewis's arms, 30 years after he had escaped from the field at Culloden, and a few days before his 51st birthday. His last words are reported to have been a prayer for his family and for the final success of the cause of American independence. George Lewis was just 19, the same age Mercer had been at Culloden. Hugh Mercer was accorded a hero's funeral attended by thousands. He was described as a soldier, a patriot, and a friend to the rights of mankind. The 10 crucial days were the turning point in the fight to create the independent United States of America. Hugh Mercer was the fallen hero and a powerful inspiration to others to fight on. His final resting place is in Laurel Hill Cemetery near Philadelphia. There are Mercer counties in various different states named in his honour. There's a statue of him, sword in hand, in Fredericksburg. Look him up online and you'll find lots of information. Many reenactors and others who are passionate about history remember him. Yet although he remains a hero in Fredericksburg, he became a forgotten hero elsewhere in the United States and in his native northeast of Scotland. Indeed, 2 biographies of him, written at different times, use the description forgotten hero in their titles. Awareness of him comes and goes. He gets a name check in the hit musical Hamilton. In 2017, his sword was presented by the St. Andrew's Society of Philadelphia to the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. There's a plaque remembering him in his father's church on the Peat Hill above Rosehearty. Apologies for the somewhat fuzzy photo. It was a very blustery day. In 2005, another plaque in his memory was placed on the wall of the quadrangle at Marischal College in Aberdeen. The suggestion came from a member of the public. The university had been unaware of Hugh Mercer up until then. Although this sketch is often used as a picture of Hugh Mercer, it's actually of one of his sons. The artist who painted the death of General Mercer used him as a help in getting his father's face right. As possibly did the artist who painted George Washington at the Battle of Princeton, Mercer's face is very youthful in this image. Father and son must have borne a strong resemblance to each other, so I think we can assume Hugh looked very like this when he was a young medical student in Aberdeen. His friends remembered him as being well-educated, well-read, sociable, and with a good sense of humour. Another tribute said this: "In General Mercer we lost a chief who for education, talents, experience, disposition, integrity and patriotism was second to no man but the Commander-in-Chief and was qualified to fill the highest trust of the country." A recent excellent biography of Mercer takes its title from these words: "Second to no man but the Commander-in-Chief, Hugh Mercer, American Patriot."